this note is all about choosing your mechanics. So this can be a really fun part because you've got all the creative ideas and like you sort of know your budget and you're like, okay, well, how do we meld the two together between our dreams and the practical real world? Sort of how do we make games? So there's in this node we're going to be using the terms components, which are all the physical pieces you might use, so dice or cards or tokens and things like that. We'll also be talking about mechanics, which is how those components fit together. So that's the gameplay and the rules of the game. And then we'll also be talking about players and time. So as all of these get more complex, the cost of what you're making increases. And there's two ways of going about this. The first is game first. So you develop the game and you just put in whatever you need to put in to get the experience that you're wanting to give people. And then there's budget first. So where you go, well, this is how much we can spend. This is probably the scale of the thing that we can make. And then once you have that, then you choose, that'll give you your components basically, before you know the mechanics, and then you can work with those components to figure out how they're going to work and how everything's going to look. So first we'll talk about the game first approach. So that's where you, if you have a free reign over the budgets, that's really good. And you need to also take into account the likely audience interest for your style of game that you're making, and how much experience you have to both execute and balance that vision. So if you're looking at choosing mechanics, particularly for a science-based game, what I would recommend is the following 5. So there's cooperation. So that's where players are working together to achieve a specific goal, and that's more a style in terms of how the other components mechanics fit together. So we'll go into that. There's information gathering. So that can be things like flipping over cards to reveal information, or having some sort of deck that you're hunting through and you're trying to find something out. Things like that. Or you're moving around a board and revealing things, because science is a lot about searching for the truth. So that can be a really strong theme for your game. Next is points acquisition. So what I was talking about before with cooperation is that that's usually going to be a semi-required aspect of it, because science communication games are generally going to be tuned towards younger audiences and sort of folks that may not necessarily play a lot of board games or tabletop games all the time. You know, you want to have as broad an audience as possible is generally the aim. So working together can feel quite good, but you can put competitive elements in there. So for example, with Virtual Reef Diver, it's sort of cooperative in the sense that you're all data scientists trying to collect all this information about the reef and clear the reefs and then survive the emergency situations that come up on the reef. And there are some mechanics in there to help each other out. But the big part of the game is that when you guess correctly, you earn a point. And you can earn even more points for getting even more information about the organisms you encounter correct. So, yes, so points acquisition is good because a lot of people will be very familiar with that mechanic. So that means that if you guess something correctly, or as you're taking turns, you pick something up and you go, oh, cool. Or you do something successfully, you earn a point or multiple points, and then by the end of the game, either the game ends when you reach a certain number of points, which then it would be good to have a tracker, sort of like a board somewhere where you have different little tokens. Again, this increases cost, but that's not necessarily a bad thing, where you're tracking the score, and so you're trying to get to 30 or something, just to pull a random number. Or you have it that the game ends at a certain point, irrelevant to the score, but then the score is tallied. So that's how it works with Virtual Reef Diver. So you essentially, everyone collects all the cards. Once all the cards are collected from 3 separate reefs of 12 cards, then you count your points. And the person with the most wins. But then there's a game such as Animal Empire, where the game ends when 9 of the 16 kingdoms are captured, and so then sort of that's a points target in essence. You're trying to get 9 points first, and that's how you win. So points acquisition is a really good mechanic because pretty much everyone will have played a game like that and understands how it works. Another really good thing for science games is memory-based things. So they can be as simple as your standard like memory reveal, where it's like, oh, this is a turtle, that's a dolphin. Dang it. Okay, well next turn this is a turtle and a different card. Ah, that's a turtle. Yay. Those kind of memory games. But you can also do memory games where you're trying to remember sequences of things. So if you ever played that code breaking game where it was a long strip and you had a whole bunch of 4 little peg combinations that you could do, and then one player was like watching and making sure that just trying to say yes or no if you were getting the right peg combinations, and you had 20 to figure it out. I should really have graphics around me, but I'm not quite that skilled just yet. So in the future edition of The Bridge, when we update all the videos, there will be graphics. But for now, you just have me waving my hands and holding up various things around my workspace. So yeah, memory can be really good, so you're just trying to remember stuff, or facts, things like that. So again, I'll bring back Virtual Reef Diver because this is how we developed it essentially, is we were like, well, we want to teach kids about organisms on the reef, what types of things there are. So yeah, the primary mechanic is looking at a card and going, what type of thing is that? Is it a coral? Is it a algae? Is it a mammal? Yes. So memory is a good one because it's very appealing. People are used to it. And finally, trading. So didn't use trading in that game, but trading is a really good mechanic because it means that you get a lot of player interaction, and it allows people to generally assign their own value to things, and that leads to deeper engagement with the game. So if we were going to look at a data science or sort of just general scientific example, so in the game Sats and Stats that we're developing, which is about satellite science, you have a planet and you can go down and you can colonize different areas, or explore different areas and take resources from them. Those resources are then used to build different ships and things, and those ships cost various combinations of resources, and so you then have the impetus that sometimes someone will have something you need and you might have something that they need. So you can put in these mechanics where people will need to find different things, or over the course of the game they collect different things, and either as a defined part of your round, or like turn sequence, they're allowed to trade, or you can force trading, or things like that. So yes, those 5 are really good. Cooperation, information gathering, points acquisition, memory, and trading tend to be quite suitable to making science games. So then in terms of, you can also use those mechanics if you're doing budget first development, because they're sort of independent of needing to have specific advanced components necessarily. So to do trading, you can just use cards. To do a memory thing, you can just use cards, points, information gathering, cooperation. You don't need, for example, to put little cubes into little ships and then move them around. You don't necessarily need to, which increases your component cost. You don't need to assemble anything like building a little reef out of physical components. So like building is absolutely a possible mechanic that you could absolutely choose to use, especially if you're doing something about an ecosystem. Maybe you're building like an ecosystem, but a lot of these things that I'm talking about right now can be done just using cards to keep your costs down. So budget first is, yes, again, where it can be potentially safer because it lessens the chance of integrating a core mechanic that is very expensive. So again, in that example where if your primary mechanic is building physically stuff and then trying not to have it topple over, sort of like Jenga or something like that, like maybe you're trying to build a reef and there's different corals and algae and they all have to have different colors and things like that. That's really cool, but that's going to cost a lot of money to manufacture, which is fine if you have a large budget, but you might not. So I have included a table in the printable materials section of this page, of this node, so the choose mechanics node. I'd really recommend having a look at that. But in general, it's going to be, the way to read that table, and I'll just talk about it, is the smaller and simpler your game, combined with the number of different components you have, both the number of components and the amount of each component is going to obviously increase your cost. So just doing a simple Uno-like card game, 1,000 copies, is going to be about $3,500. If you read through the if you watched or read the defining budgets node, then you sort of would have I go through into a lot more detail about why that is. But I'm going to keep going. If you're going to add dice to a simple Uno game, so maybe you're trying to represent the chaos of atoms or how many cards people can draw based on interactions and things like that, that might put an extra $500 on top of that. So for 1,000 copies, that's about 50 cents per dice. So I would say just adding a single dice is probably going to add 50 cents, both in weight. The box will need to be bigger, that kind of thing. If you're including tokens for any reason, so that could be for your points acquisition, or it could be for like a small scale building game, that'll probably also be about 50 cents per copy, so about $500 for 1,000. That can be really cool. Play mats. So that includes physical rigid boards, but also something you roll out, or maybe like a board on the table. It's not going to add a whole bunch of expense necessarily, but it will add, again, scale and weight and box size and all of those kind of factors. So that will be about $1,000, I'm going to say, because yeah, $1 per one of those boards makes sense to me, as you might come up with your own custom arrangements, so that's the ballpark that I would personally say you're playing in. And then if you want to add wooden parts, which are very cool, and I would recommend doing that whenever possible, they're very cost effective actually, because like little meeples and things like that, but they will cost about, again, $1 per game, because I assume you don't just want one, you're probably going to want a few, like maybe you have like fishes that are going to be swimming around the reef and they're little wooden, painted blue cubes. Color is relevant to cost, by the way, unless you're doing raw wood, but and you can also get generic tokens and things like that to include in your game, which is a really a cool way to do it. That'll run you about $1,000. And then if you want full-scale plastic minis, I'm not even going to bother talking about it for the next two examples that I'm going to talk about, because really that's going to cost you something like $50,000 dollars to make. Not because they're expensive individually. So doing the injection molding is actually extremely cheap, because they just get a mold, a steel mold, and you clap it together, they squirt plastic in, it cools, it opens, they all tumble down, you're done. But those molds are ultra expensive. So even one is going to be about $7,000 US, not including the expense that it will take to 3D model that, and then any mess ups and things like that are going to cause sort of conflicts and retooling and stuff like that. But absolutely, if you have the resources to do that, go for it. The bridge is sort of more tuned towards games without minis. So, but absolutely include them if you can, if you have the budget for it. That's awesome. And 3D printing is also an option as well. But an individual, you'll still have to pay 3D modeling, which is fine and not too bad if you have a collaborator on your project, or students or something like that want some experience in the industry and want to work on a project that'll become an actual thing. But 3D printing, just remember, it's not going to be as high fidelity, so it might not look as good, depending on the resources that you have available. But that'll be about $1 per thing anyway. And so if you're doing, 50, like if you're doing 5 of those for your game for 1,000 copies at $1 each, it's going to end up being about 50,000 anyway. So maybe about 5,000, but just keep that in mind, that as soon as you go into 3D, it's quite expensive. Okay, so next up would be a medium scale game, sort of like Monopoly. So you have a bunch of little pieces, you might be using wooden tokens or plastic or metal tokens based on what you have, but 1,000 copies of those will probably run you about $10,000, and then adding dice will be 1,000 more, Tokens is 1,000 more. Playmats will be 1,000 more, and wooden parts probably 2,500 more. So if you're looking at a massive, full-featured, I would say that Animal World War was probably a medium-scale game. You know, it had a lot of different bits and pieces, but yeah, so that was going to be around between 16 and 20,000 US. And finally, a really heavy game such as some of those crazy ones like Gloomhaven or Risk or possibly even Scythe. Maybe not because they. But just big box games with lots of pieces in them. Cthulhu Wars, if you've heard of that, they'll be around $20,000 at a minimum just to produce 10,000 of them. I do have in the column like just cards for a very heavy game. They do exist. You can get games that are just monstrous in terms of the amount of cards and things you get. Like a full, you couldn't really do a game of that scale without extra components. I would like to see it done. But we're talking about games that just have a monster load of parts. And can be very good at simulating science because you have essentially just everything. You can include all the different parts. You can have like a hadron collider in the middle. Maybe you're assembling resources for that. Maybe you've got universities and science and things. You can go ridiculous with it, but that will cost you about minimum $20,000, I would estimate. And then, however, the individual component costs might not go up by that much. So everything will still be at about $1,000 for dice and tokens and playmats. You know, for 1,000 copies. You know, it's when you're already pumping multiple tens of thousands of dollars just even to the base cardboard of something, then the cost will probably offset. The wooden parts, if you want to have those, will probably be more about 5,000 because we would have more of them correspondingly. And to do minis for a massive Risk-like game would be around $100,000, I would assume. But again, you might be able to find different costs and different details. Just take into account that you do need to factor into the cost like 3D modeling and artwork and stuff like that if that's what you're hoping to compensate for. So in terms of choosing mechanics, I would say look at your components. Okay, you can break apart again as we went into identifying mechanics node. You can break your thing apart into different pieces and go, how do those pieces work together between each other? So if you're building an ecosystem game, it's like, wow, fish component, eat mechanic, smaller fish component. Okay, and they can be cards, and the mechanic is you just slap one on top of it, and that replaces it, and maybe every round you're adding new smaller fish or algae or things like that. That kind of thing. I might actually turn that into a game because that sounds kind of fun. But yes, so thank you for watching this. Choosing your mechanics, I would essentially just tear everything apart into components, figure out how they work together. And next we're going to go on to prototyping, which is where you see, does any of your ideas actually work? Talk to you soon.